Hello, everyone, and welcome to the With Chinese Characteristics podcast. I'm Natalie.
I'm Cherry.
And together we talk about topics with Chinese characteristics. And today we have an episode that I have been waiting for. Well, part one of an episode I have been waiting for a long time. It's about the one, the only, the man, the myth, the legend, the president, the emperor, Yuan Shikai.
He has many hats.
He has many hats, and I have alluded to him in multiple episodes. He is a person who, for a long period of time in Chinese history, was like a stock character, a one-dimensional person, a cardboard cutout. He was the person who screwed it all up. He's the person who China was on the cusp of becoming this republic, this land of the people, as Sun Yat-sen had envisioned. Mm-hmm. And then old man Yuan Shikai came in and just
declared himself emperor.
Declared himself emperor and ruined it. But in recent years...
So that's how I know him.
Yeah.
Being educated in China. And I think if you may have heard of him, if you went to school in China or if you learned Chinese history in college, you might have heard of him because his name does pop up everywhere.
And if you haven't heard of him, don't worry, because we're going to talk all about him. And I hope by the end of this episode, you will agree he's a very interesting guy. And his life touches on and explains a lot of the past, that whole era of Chinese history. All right, so I'm going to start with my little blurb I've written. So in 1912, Yuan Shikai was elected unanimously as the first president of the Republic of China. Widely respected both within and without China, he was seen as the most competent general, administrator, and diplomat within the entire country. Ending millennia of dynastic rule, he was hailed as China's George Washington, the steward of the nation who would shepherd it to a future as a powerful, vibrant republic. By the start of 1916, 4 years later, he was near universally despised, mocked, and ridiculed. Cowering in the imperial palace, he ruled over a China rapidly fragmenting into camps of dueling warlords. Within 6 months, he would be dead, laid low by stress, overwork, and a mysterious family curse. His legacy would be as a figure of hatred and scorn, along with their admiration of Sun Yat-sen. Condemnation of Yuan Shikai is one of the few things that communists and nationalists could agree on. This will be a two-part episode where we talk about the rise and fall of China's first president and its last emperor, the legendary Yuan Shikai. So at part one, it's going to be called Everybody Loves Yuan Shikai, and we'll go up to when he was elected as the first president of the Republic of China. And then the second one will be Everyone Hates Yuan Shikai, which we will cover what he did as president of the Republic of China.
Yeah.
Okay.
Can I ask a question, or maybe I'm jumping to the show?
You can ask a question, Jerry.
I thought Sun Yat-sen was the first president of the Republic of China.
Okay. So technically, yes. He was elected the provisional president of the Nanjing assembly, which was saying
it was a transitional government.
Well, no, which was saying it was the rightful government of all China.
Okay.
Right? Because they did a revolution in Shanghai and in Nanjing, and they're like, we're the new Chinese Republic, but nobody took it seriously, right? Like they had armies, but the rest of China wasn't listening necessarily. But we'll get to it. Okay. So it's debatable, but I would say Yuan Shikai. Shikai, so family name Yuan. Yuan. Personal name Shikai. Shikai was born on September 16th, 1859, the day of a great victory by his great uncle against the Nian Rebellion, which was a rebellion going on the same time as the Taiping Rebellion in China. Lots of Taiping Civil War. The Kai in his name is for victory because he was born on the day of this great battle. He was born to a concubine, which is not the main wife. We talked about this in our Concubines to Comrades episode, but very common for wealthy Chinese families to have one wife and a bunch of concubines to pump out more kids. And he grew up basically like in a fort because China was so racked by civil war that any family with money would essentially build a fort to live in instead of a village. So his family was Han, not Manchu, who are the ethnicity of the ruling dynasty, and had been quite poor up until recently, when his great-grandfather had passed the lowest level of the civil service examination. This opened doors, which future generation used to pass successively higher exams until the Yuan family became full of degree holders. So obviously, the intention of his family was for him to become another scholar. However, Shikai was an energetic, active child who enjoyed action and adventure more than books. He was also spoiled and played pranks on his teachers rather than studying. There's one account that I've read in every single biography mentions it, which is one time at night, he caught a bunch of fireflies and he smashed them into like a paste and he spread it all over his face and he used it to scare his tutor in the middle of the night, thinking he was like a ghost.
Because his face would glow up?
His face would glow. So,
okay.
And apparently this so traumatized the tutor that the tutor just quit. And apparently he was spanked for this. But so he had to pass the exam though, right? Because in China, action was for peasants and I guess soldiers and criminals, right? If you're really going to make it in the Qing court, you need to be a august scholar. Fortunately though, he was adopted by one of his uncles who was childless and became a full son basically in the inheritance.
So he was legit.
He was legit then for his uncle, but
right.
Same thing. Still Yuan family. So he went to Nanjing and studied there. He went to Beijing to study there, and he basically studied his whole life. But he took his education more seriously as he got older, though he always liked writing and apparently womanizing and martial arts and all that kind of stuff.
Was he a playboy?
Well, okay, so it's interesting because there have been a lot of books written about him in Chinese, obviously. One of the early claims is that when he was in Nanjing and he was like 11, he was hanging out in brothels.
He was 11 and
he was
hanging out in brothels?
And there's a more recent biography that came out which kind of compiled a lot of these Chinese sources in English. And it's like, okay, well, it could be possible that at some point he went to a brothel in Nanjing, but I doubt he was sleeping around at 11 with all these women, right? So there's some claims that have been put on his childhood to justify his reputation later in life.
Okay.
But he did love the ladies, okay?
Not when he was 11 necessarily.
No, he got first married at 17.
Okay. Which at the time in China is not that outrageous.
Normal, but he had a bunch of concubines. We'll get into how much he loved the ladies later. But,
okay.
So while he was studying in Beijing, he was smart, but there was some reservations his relatives had about his future as a scholar. For example, he was mediocre at calligraphy. Big part of it. You can't be a good administrator unless you can do calligraphy. His uncle described him as a middle upper talent, which sort of seems,
in calligraphy or in everything?
In general,
okay.
in intellect. He said he's a middle upper talent, which kind of seems like a bit of a backhanded compliment. And his other uncle said his intelligence was not the highest because he was extremely hyperactive. Another thing that hurt his studies was his adoptive father, his birth father, and one of the uncles training him all died while he was studying for the exam. And on the one hand, that's an emotional toll.
Yeah.
But the other hand, in Imperial China, if you're a person of any importance, there's all these rules you have to do if somebody in your family dies.
Yeah.
Like if your father dies, if your mother dies, there's all this mourning, there's all these ceremonies, you have to go into reclusion for a certain number of months. And
yeah.
So it's a big
3 years sometimes.
Yeah. So it's a big drain on trying to get the civil service exam passed. And this is the Ren family curse, which is all men in the family died before they were 60, and they all died in their 50s.
Wow.
All his uncles and brothers. So,
okay.
So it was something he himself was keenly aware of. It was considered common knowledge that this was. So maybe it was stress, maybe it was some genetic thing, but he kept studying, but his attention kept being drawn away from the Confucian classics, which is basically all they taught. All that the civil service exam checked you on was how well you could argue about and write about the Confucian classics.
Why would he be drawn away from it? It's the most interesting topic in the whole world.
I know, right? It's the best, Sherry. That's the only qualification you need to run a country. But he liked reading books on military matters, politics, and strategy. So in any case, he failed twice at the lowest level of the exams in 1876 and 1879. So when he was 17 and 21 or 20, respectively.
Mm-hmm.
There are 3 levels of the degree. There's the regional, the provincial, and the Imperial. Each harder and with increasing levels of prestige. You have to pass one to get to be able to take the next one.
It's like a video game.
Yeah, it's a bit vague, but supposedly he bought the first rank, which, as much as it's seen as this egalitarian thing, anybody can pass and be, it's all just based on how well you know Confucius.
Mm-hmm. But it's not. You can also buy it.
You can also buy it. You have to be recommended for it, which...
So you have to have the connections and the money?
You have to have the connections and the money. And apparently this was a big source of income for the treasury.
I think so, yeah.
People buying exams. But if you didn't pass at least one exam at one point, so if you can test out of the easy one and then pass the next one, but if you never actually pass any, it seems you weren't really treated like a real degree holder, right? It was like you get an honorary diploma from Harvard. You know what I mean?
No one expects you to be a real doctor.
Engineer or doctor or something.
Yeah.
So he wanted to pass one for real. And it wasn't uncommon to fail the exam multiple times. The pass rate for the provincial or the regional one, the lowest one was like, I think, 20% or something.
20%. That's really low.
Yeah. And the highest one was like 1% only passed, the imperial exam. So it wasn't a disaster, right? I think we talked about the Taiping Emperor, the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom. One of the things that caused him to snap and start his revolution was he failed the exam like 7 times. He failed it a bunch of times. So it wasn't like Yuan Shikai, who's from a wealthy family. He doesn't necessarily, he'll probably be okay if he doesn't pass it. But
so we won't judge him based on the fact that he had failed.
So he doesn't mean he's stupid, right? I mean, he could just mean that he didn't like Confucius that much. So he ended up being given the provincial degree anyway, the Juren, which is the second level, for his efforts doing disaster relief with his uncle for the Qing court. Despite the mess China was in on the world stage, the rivers still flooded, the people still starved, and the imperial court still had to be a functional government. And that's something to keep in mind, that even while from the outside, it's like, this is a complete mess, no one's in charge, the Qing court is just doing crazy stuff. It's like, China is a land where you can't just let it sit there. It's not like England. Everything's going to kind of be okay. You have to actively manage the rivers. You have to actively manage all these dikes and canals and waterways. And you can't just sit back. The rivers flood, they burst the bank, everybody dies. So you have to have a government in place. And the Qing government was still doing these things.
Yeah.
So this experience doing disaster relief that got him his second level degree convinced him that the greatest threat to China and the common people of China was political instability, something that would change little over the years. Because he's like, somebody has to do this stuff, right? We have to. It's not even about foreigners necessarily.
You have to have a functional government.
You have to have a functional government at all times, because peasants don't have the resources to do these things, right, on their own. So, but still, after failing the exam the second time in 1879, he swore off studying Confucius. He burned all his classical poems and calligraphy, and he determined to make his career in the army. This is what apparently he wrote down. A great man should devote himself to the country and fight on the battlefield to expel invaders from the outside. How could I confine myself for so long between the writing brush and the ink slab? How wasteful is it if I continue to do so? And he's like, you know what? Screw this.
You don't want me in? I'm out.
Yeah. Screw Confucius.
I'm going to go ride some horses.
Yeah, I'm going to go
fight some wars.
So he went to Shandong province, where he joined an army under Wu Chenxing, a friend of his foster father. There he continued to study for the exam by learning military matters. So apparently he really still did want to pass the exam, because he said, I will die with everlasting regret if I cannot earn a Juren degree, which is the middle one.
The middle one, yeah.
But he only had the honorary one for his disaster relief. But in 1882, China changed its stance toward Korea. It began to take an active role and treat it more like a colony than a client state. And Shikai was part of the army sent to cement this. So historically, Korea has been a client state to China.
You mean like a vassal?
Yeah, not even really a vassal, because it sort of depends, because it's supposed to be an autonomous kingdom.
Yeah.
And China just you're doing your own thing, but you're still a tributary of the Chinese court.
Yeah.
Whether that's the Qing court or the Song court or the Ming court.
Yeah.
Whenever Chinese court is there.
Yeah.
You're supposed to send the little emissaries and give the gifts and,
Yeah.
kowtow and whatever the ceremony is for the time. So after the experience with foreigners, China, I think, realized, or the Qing court realized, like, okay, if we don't colonize Korea, essentially, they will. So instead of just kind of sitting back and seeing what happens, they're like, no, we have to kind of turn it into almost like a puppet state. And so Yuan Shikai was part of the army sent to do this. Complicating things, though, was the Imo Mutiny, where part of the Korean military rebelled and, among other things, burned down the Japanese legation. China and Japan both sent troops, as both knew the first group to get control of the situation would be the de facto ruler of Korea. So they rebelled. The Korean court basically couldn't control them either. Shikai took a personal role in landing the troops. He apparently found the landing spot and got injured landing the troops and led them to the capital. He apprehended the imperial regent, who was the one behind the mutiny, and did some kind of very brave things of his own initiative, which essentially put the rebellion down before the Japanese could get control of the country.
So it was a big success for him.
It was a big success for him, even though he was a nobody.
Right.
He was just this junior person.
But he made his name
He made his name. This was his first. This is the first time basically Yuan Shikai became noticed. So he was promoted to a senior officer and won renown from the commander of the expedition. He unyieldingly disciplined the troops and commanded them with skill. He was always the first soldier to fight the rebels and engaged in battles with unusual valor. This is the commander of the expedition. Li Hongjiang also noticed him and maneuvered to have him promoted to a 5th rank official, which is now you're in the imperial system. And he's not Han, he's not Manchu. He's Han Chinese. And at this point, he's only 23, right? which is astronomically young.
Yeah.
For anybody in this period of Chinese history, unless they're like a bandit lord or something. Right. Because the whole thing with these with these civil service examinations is by the time you actually pass them all and you get to do anything, you're like 35.
Yeah, it's you have to climb a ladder one by one.
Yes.
Yeah.
So you spend your 20s
do your time
studying or whatever.
Yeah.
So as part of it,
so he just swooped up.
He just swooped up
with his military career.
Yeah, right. 22, 21, he's a failed scholar, burning his poems, and now he's a 5th rank official, and he is this kind of senior role in Korea. One of the roles given to him was training the Korean army to resist Japanese encroachment, and he became the main Qing representative in Korea. In 1884, this all came to a head because the Japanese staged a coup to try and seize Korea. They were going to wait until everyone was drunk at a party they were hosting. This is very like Three Kingdoms, like plan, but this is 1880s.
Yeah.
So they were like, we'll have a party, we'll get everybody drunk, and then when everybody's drunk, we'll set a bunch of stuff on fire in the city, and then while everybody's trying to figure out what's going on, we'll storm the royal palace, kidnap the king, and say the king wants us to form a new government. And no, you can't see the king. He's fine. He wants us to do this. So they did that. And they messed some stuff up, but they basically, by the end of the night or by the end of the situation, they had the king, Japanese soldiers were in the capital. They're telling the Korean army, oh, there's a new government now. The king's cool with this. Everything's great. Shikai realized what was going on. And he realized what was going on even beforehand. Because apparently he was doing things like telling his troops to sleep with their boots on, and things like that. Because they're like, he's like, this is going to kick off at any moment. And
he was prepared.
He was prepared, and he had previously sent to Li Hongjiang for more troops. In our episode on the Black Flag Army, which is one of our earlier episodes, one of the reasons why the Qing armies couldn't really shove it to the French, even though they were winning on land, is because all this stuff was going down in Korea. And they're like, okay, we're going to lose Korea if we don't send more troops there.
Yeah.
So he asked for more troops, but Yuan Shikai is a man of action, Cherry. He is this ultimate action hero, and if you ever see a picture of him, you'll understand what I mean.
We'll put a picture.
We'll put a picture in there.
For the cover.
So he led the 3 battalions of Qing troops that were there to rescue the king. The Korean army was initially siding with the new government, but switched sides once they realized that they were fighting Yuan Shikai, who had trained them. And he basically stormed up through the bullets. The Japanese lost. They burned down their own legation and ran away. And the king was rescued by Shikai.
Wow.
So his prompt action kept Korea out of Japanese hands for the next decade and led to hatred, but also a grudging respect of Shikai by Japan from then on out. Apparently, they complained a lot, and they kept telling Li Hongjiang that he should punish him and all these things, but Li Hongjiang had his back. And he's like, no, I'm not punishing Yuan Shikai because he didn't do anything wrong. So, and
the Japanese was complaining to Li Hongjiang?
Yeah, because they're like...
They staged the coup, though.
I know, but they're like, oh, this, because, well, there was a bit of a back and forth about who shot first. Because they took over the palace. Okay. They kidnapped the king, essentially.
Yeah.
And...
So didn't they...
But they didn't shoot anybody yet. And then Yuan Shikai came to rescue him, and it's not clear who started shooting first. If the Japanese soldiers started shooting first, or if the Qing troops started shooting first. Western observers think that the Japanese started shooting first. And Yuan Shikai claimed they started shooting first. But obviously they're going to say, hey, the king wanted us to form a new government.
Yeah.
And we're just, helping him
You just gotta
out.
believe it.
We just got to believe it.
That's fascinating.
So
it doesn't matter if you staged the coup or not.
Yeah, right.
If the people who came to stop the coup shot at you first, which they should.
Yeah.
Then it was their fault.
Yeah. I mean, well, the argument would be, well, on what authority do these Qing troops have to stop a coup?
True.
Right? Did the king ask you?
It's not their country. Yeah.
He escorted the remainder of the Japanese legation and their families out of the country. Because when they burned down their thing and fled, they left all these people behind, right? Like people's kids and spouses and whatever. So he escorted them out, right? And he was like, I'm the bigger man here.
These are civilians.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So he continued to resist Japanese domination of Korea, but also any attempts for Korean independence. For example, diplomats or treaties with foreign powers. So he wouldn't let Korea, send out diplomats to the United States because, he's like, okay, no, you're part of China. We can protect you.
Right.
The stability he brought to the country, though, did attract Chinese merchants. In 1885, China's trade with Korea was 1/3 that of Japan's. In 1893, China had more trade than Japan. So, firmly now back in the Chinese sphere of influence, Korea. However, this all ended in 1894 with the Sino-Japanese War, when essentially they just took over the country with troops.
Right.
They didn't mess around anymore with these plots because I guess Yuan Shikai was too good at the plots. And
Yuan Shikai was good at the plots too.
And and it's a long, but basically they just took
the gloves.
They just took the gloves off and essentially just took control of the country.
Right.
So Yuan Shikai forced to flee, and he became convinced that China needed a modern army that could resist Western or Japanese forces.
Right.
Yuan Shikai sometimes blamed for this war, but only in that his control of Korea was so effective, the Japanese had to resort to an actual war instead of coups and politics to oust him. So he didn't leave any room for anything other than just invading the country.
Right. It wasn't a situation. Let's both do business here.
Yeah.
Let's both just control Korea.
No.
Like the other countries did China.
The whole time, right? Japan was up to schemes.
Yeah.
But the king was like real buddy with Yuan Shikai because Yuan Shikai was the guy who saved him from the coup.
Right.
So, he, I think, looked up to Yuan Shikai.
But the Japanese got pissed off eventually.
Yeah, the Japanese were like, you know what, screw this. Let's just take over the country. So China was just utterly wrecked in the war, and everybody knew they needed a modern army. They chose Yuan Shikai to do the job because, he's a national hero, Cherry.
How old is he at this point?
He's, I think, like 35, like early 30s. So his superior during the war, because he did fight in the war too, after he escaped Korea, he went back with the troops to kind of try and fight them. But, as we've said in many episodes, the Chinese troops during this period were not of good quality. They didn't have modern weapons. They were badly trained. Yeah. They were poorly led. So his superior in the war said, Ren is sagacious, brave, and knowledgeable. By nature, he is loyal and honest. When he handles business, he always does it in an orderly manner. He is definitely one of the most outstanding officials. We often lament the hardship in finding talent, yet it would be more pitiful if we have a man of talent but we do not use him properly while allowing him to waste his talent in trivial routines. So...
That's some nice
compliments.
Well,
I mean, he single-handedly basically kept Korea out of Japan's midst for
a while.
For 10 years.
Right.
10, 12 years longer than it would have otherwise.
So he's got a good reputation, based on that.
And when I say that, I don't, he probably was not a hero to the Koreans because it's kind of just trading one master for another.
Yeah. But to China, he was.
But to the perspective of the Qing court.
Yeah.
So his army was small, approximately 5,000, but used European training and important equipment. It was called the newly established army, Xinjiang Lujun.
Xinjiang Lujun.
Okay.
Yeah, not Xinjiang, the province. It means newly established. It's exactly what you said.
Newly established corps or whatever.
Newly established land army, actually. Yeah.
It was based off the Germans, seen to be the best at the time. Incorporated new methods, European methods for developing an army. For example, instead of promoting officers based on battlefield feats, which was the prior method, some guy was the first one to climb over the wall, so you make him in charge of everybody else.
Right.
He promoted them based on intelligence and understanding of modern military theory. Discipline was harsh, and deserters were beaten and demoted to coolies, which are like manual laborers.
Okay. I was like, that word coolie sounds familiar.
Yeah.
Yeah. Manual labor is what they mean here.
Yeah, in this sense. And so he opened up military academies and all these other things because, it's not enough to just be good at fighting. You have to.
So this is a lot of modernizing. This is sounds like pretty big steps. Yeah. Did he have any resistance? Was this encouraged by the Qing court?
I think the shock of the Qing court is the one who paid him to do it.
Okay.
They basically wrote him a blank check and they're like, whatever you got to do. Because the whole thing with the self-strengthening movement, which was the prior meta tactic, if you will, was we can keep everything the same, but we'll just have modern stuff, right? So we'll have our normal armies, but they'll have modern guns. We'll have, instead of a road, we'll have a railroad. But there's no, but these armies are still going to be led in the same way. We're still going to put Confucian scholars in charge of them.
Right.
Right. There was no real, attempt to actually change anything but the window dressing. Mm-hmm. So, but this is a completely Western army. So his force was considered the most effective in China by foreign observers. People were like, it's the only real army in China. As one British admiral put it, watching them do drills, if all the Chinese men were like General Yuan Shikai, the armies and their financial arrangements would not be in the condition they are now. So foreigners love Yuan Shikai. Some officials were jealous and attacked him, but Shikai had friends in high places, such as the Manchu high official Wrong Lu. So, and if you Boxer Rebellion, he's a high up guy. He comes up a lot. So overall, he tried to create a new type of soldier, new relationship to the state. He said, you do not belong to any traditional class categories of scholars, peasants, manufacturers, or merchants, and emphasized they were servants of the people, insisting that only with their support could the army be victorious. So historically, in Confucian thought, soldiers are the lowest. Yeah. The only difference between a soldier and a bandit and a criminal really in Confucian is who they're fighting for, but they're all bad, right? In a perfect...
It's a low level of... They're like the lower class of society. It's not well respected as a career.
Yeah.
It's not a career. It's something you have to do.
It's lower than peasant.
Yeah.
And so, he's trying to say...
Lower than farmers.
Lower than farmers.
Yeah.
And, and he had to do everything from scratch. For example, he had to create Western-style songs and marches and bands and instruments. And apparently some of them are still used even today.
So before, Chinese armies didn't have this little march and band unit to encourage everyone.
Well, they did, but they had Chinese instruments.
Okay.
So this was when they're like,
instruments.
Yeah, we're Western instruments. We're going to have Western drums and bugles and...
Fun.
Yeah, and trumpets and all that stuff. So up until now, Ren's record was mostly positive. However, from here, things get a bit more controversial.
Are we not going to love him anymore?
Well, we're still going to love him.
Okay. For a while.
I think he's still good.
Okay.
So he believed that the strategy of, this is Li Hongjiang's strategy of taming foreigners by utilizing foreigners was fundamentally flawed, where you're just like, oh, well, we need a foreign army. We'll just hire some foreigners to be the army, right? We need a better tax system. We'll just hire a foreigner.
It sounds like too good of a deal.
Yeah.
Taming foreigners by using foreigners.
Well, he said, it may achieve momentary peace, yet no foreign power can absorb China's calamities for her. This is Yuan Shikai. He thought China needed to stop being so vain, stop thinking it was just somehow fundamentally better than all these other countries, and needed to learn from foreigners. And because previously, you would just hire a foreign company to build you a railroad and to run the railroad. And you wouldn't, be like, oh, well, we don't need to learn how. We'll just let these barbarian, people do it for us. But, Yuan Shikai...
And we sell them some tea. We have enough silver.
Yeah, we have enough silver. It'll be fine.
What do we care? Yeah.
So his other views included respecting talent instead of tradition. He was big on reforming the learning system to emphasize modern subjects instead of Chinese classics. I wonder why. Stop discrimination against merchants and businessmen, who are also lower than farmers in the Confucian social hierarchy. Train Chinese managers and experts instead of simply hiring Westerners. Foster nationalism by reminding soldiers of past national humiliations. And reform the civil exam system. So he valued stability, sustainability, and accountability. Actions needed to be attempted, analyzed, and successes would be repeated. However, he was not a revolutionary or even a radical reformer.
Sounds like a lot of reform to me.
But I think, he's not like Sun Yat-sen, who's like, burn it all down, we need a republic.
So is he the kind of guy who says, let's improve upon what we have?
Yeah, let's try some stuff.
Let's keep the system and then improve from within.
Yeah. And he, I think, was afraid that if you pushed China too far and it broke, you couldn't put it back together. That things are fragile enough that you got to be careful because China's not strong enough to withstand a big shock. So, which leads us to the 100 Days, which is the famous last-ditch attempt by the Qing court or by people in the Qing court to reform the country, or not reform the country, to reform the Qing court,
the government system
into something that they thought could better handle the modern world. Yeah, and there's all sorts of stuff.
Yeah, it's called 百日维新 in Chinese.
This is
it's 100-day reform. Movement.
And it was led by a group of reformers, who there's a whole bunch of them, and the young emperor, who was excited, who read modern political theory and liked to talk to all these reformers.
Yeah, I think he grew up, Guangxu, the emperor, grew up like learning English with like British, maybe not British, Western priests, as his teachers and all that. And
at this point, Cixi, who's the Dowager Empress, who just perches like a hawk over this entire 50-year period of China, she was no longer the regent. She had stepped away. So technically, she was no longer in the government system.
Not officially.
But... So in order to do this, they knew they would have to deal with the arch reactionary, who was Cixi, who is the ultimate conservative.
Yes, I guess she was, yeah.
And so basically, and because some of the things they have to do, it is going to limit the prestige and power of the current Manchu princes and things, right? So they're not going to like it, right? And
no. So Cixi later in her life was decided to actually do a lot of things that they did here.
Yes.
It was kind of too late. Yeah. And only after she had. I'm giving it away.
Yeah.
Continue, please.
So they're like, okay, Sushi's not going to like this. So what we got to do.
They were right.
Is we got to kidnap her, essentially.
No.
So they're like, we have to detain her, right? We have to, but we're not going to do anything bad to her, but we're going to put her in a nice little house. She can watch the ducks in the pond.
Like Game of Thrones or something.
That's the entirety of Chinese history. Game of Thrones, right? So they're like, okay, this is what we got to do. So they're like, who do we know that has a competent army that's not a Manchu? That's not a Manchu, right? Because the Manchu troops are going to go for Cixi, right? And they want to keep their privilege.
They got Yuan Shikai to kidnap the.
So they went to Yuan Shikai.
Oh my
and they're
God.
like, and they gave him a letter. They're like, Yuan Shikai, this is the emperor needs you to do this. He needs you to take your army. And Yuan Shikai's like, I don't know. He's like, how do I know that's really the emperor, right?
Right.
And they're
True.
And they're like, no, it's really the emperor. And he's like, let me think about it. And then he went to visit Ronglu, and he told Ronglu, and he's like, these guys want me to take over the thing.
And Ronglu turned around and told Cixi, let me guess.
Yeah. Well, so apparently, that's the traditional view, is that is that Yuan Shikai sold them out, and then they just went around and started lopping off their heads.
Yeah.
But supposedly, modern people think they already knew about it by then.
Modern historians?
Yeah, modern historians. However, they didn't know. One thing that really gave them a harsher response is when they learned that they were asking Yuan Shikai to bring his army. Because at one point, it's like, okay, they're reform people, right?
Yeah.
And then it's like, okay, well, now it's a coup, right? Now it's an attempted coup if you're going around and talking to generals and trying to get them to bring their army to the capital.
Yeah.
So they killed all the reformers who didn't run away.
They did.
They put the Guangxu emperor into like house arrest, essentially, and he hated Yuan Shikai for the rest of his life. Apparently, though, later when Yuan Shikai was president, he built a monument to the 6 people who died. So seemingly he felt
Maybe
bad.
He felt kind of
guilty. He felt kind of bad about it.
Yeah.
But I think he did.
In retrospect, he's like, China needed the modernization.
Yeah.
they would.
So this is probably the first sin that comes out where people are like, Yuan Shikai's a bad dude, right?
Yeah.
In the historical record. But this is a speed bump to what we're going to get up to later.
Okay.
And probably, even if he had said yes, the counter coup was happening almost immediately.
Right.
And he couldn't have gotten his troops there in time anyway. He spent the next 2 years, and this is after this, he's best friends with Cixi. Now, I don't think she necessarily knew who he was that much before now, but now she's
gotta know who
he's her number one best bud, Yuan Shikai. So he spent the next 2 years as governor of Shandong province, which is close to Beijing. And it's only really notable because this is 1899 to 1901, which is the high point of the Boxer uprising, the Boxer rebellion.
Yeah.
Which we talked about in our episode, but it's basically, there's all these problems affecting China. The 100 Days was the last real attempt by the Qing court to be able to deal with them.
Yeah.
And eventually people can only take so much before they start essentially uprising, right? Yeah. And this is a very common through Chinese history. So despite his position as Cixi's favorite, he had zero tolerance for Boxers. Cixi thought like, oh, we can use these people to drive out the foreigners for us. My own troops are all cowards. Yeah. These guys are, fearless. They're invulnerable to bullets.
Yeah.
They're possessed by the spirits of the ancestors.
Mm-hmm. But Yuan Shikai didn't think.
Yuan Shikai is like, these guys are trouble. He called them bandits who engaged in a conspiracy while assuming an anti-Christian guise. He determined the root cause of the rebellion was both economic woes, like the drought and business stuff, displacement of jobs by the railroads and other things, and also from the unequal treatment of Christians under the law, which is something we talked about before, that any time there was a legal dispute between a Christian Chinese and a non-Christian, the Christian Chinese would often get missionaries to go on their side. Yeah. And because local officials didn't want to cause an international incident, it would mean that the Christians would normally win.
Yeah.
And this really pissed people off. And even if it's not necessarily 100% true all the time, this is what people believe was happening. So he forbid missionaries from intervening in legal cases. But he also stated that Christian Chinese were still Chinese and that they were equal under the law. So that you can't discriminate against Christian Chinese, but also Christian Chinese can't bring priests in. And this actually seemed to really help. He also realized that some of the more outlandish Boxer claims required unique strategies to disprove. For example, the common belief that their magic made them immune to bullets. Yeah. Yuan Shikai himself attended a public demonstration of this invulnerability, realizing that they were using underpowered bullets and other tricks. You don't put all the gunpowder in, or you don't load a bullet into the gun, so you shoot at them and
it's like a weak rubber bullet.
Yeah, or whatever, right? There's things you can do. Realizing that they were doing this, he just simply walked up and just shot the guy doing the demonstration with a pistol.
Oh my God.
And was like, yeah, he's not.
Did the guy die?
Yeah, he's like, doesn't work, guys. So martial arts training centers were destroyed. You weren't allowed to have any martial art training centers in Shandong province. Any martial arts demonstrations were outlawed. And anyone who gathered more than 20 people for physical activity that were not of their own kin was put to death.
Oh, boy.
So, however, regular Boxers were not punished, or at least not punished heavily. Maybe they were like caned or something, so long as they vowed to cease the practice. He killed over 4,000 Boxers, but his actions kept foreign armies out of the province and prevented the large-scale deaths which happened nearby Beijing and Tianjin. So,
because one thing that foreign armies were there to do was to suppress the Boxers.
Yes.
So if he did that himself,
yes,
he took care of the trouble.
he took care of the trouble. No foreigners died apparently in the entire province during the rebellion. He even
No non-Boxers did either.
no, yeah, no. Well, I mean, maybe some did, right? I
Okay,
mean, maybe somebody
not
fell
that
down a
many.
well, but
Well, yeah.
or they got old and they died, but yeah,
But he didn't go after.
he,
There was no large scale warfare.
yeah, and he kept order, and
Okay.
he basically told foreign troops like, "Don't come to Shandong province." He's like, "Nobody died here. You have no reason to come here," and he even put up a barrier at the edge of the province of like,
Right.
"Do whatever you want by Beijing, but
Right.
like you're not supposed to come here." And essentially, yeah, it kept them out, and this was what put him on the foreign radar. Now he's famous internationally because he's like,
Right.
"Oh, this is the only guy who can actually keep control of the situation." So he did not bring his armies to Beijing when Cixi called for everyone to come fight the 8-nation expedition. So if you haven't watched the episode of that, there was foreigners that were besieged in the capital in essentially like the embassy district.
What was the movie called?
55 Days in Peking.
Yeah.
And 8 nations, and this is, I'm sure every Chinese school children has taught this,
Oh, yeah.
came and essentially rescued the people in foreign eyes, but in
Yes.
Chinese eyes came and burned down the
Humiliated
city
China.
and humiliated China and all
Yeah.
this other stuff. And part of it, Sushi's like, everybody get here. We're going to fight them. The Boxers are going to help us. We're going to win. And Yuan Shikai's like, I'm sorry. We have a bad connection. I can't hear what
From
you're
Zoom.
saying.
Yeah.
So he would like
No.
send troops out, and then he'd be like, oh, wait, they forgot all their bullets. So we got to send them back, right? And all
So he was playing a game of chicken.
he was playing a game of chicken and all this
but
stuff.
he didn't want to outright say, no, I'm not coming.
No, right? Because that's a recipe for getting killed.
Yeah.
But what this did do though was actually help him even more, because since his province was so close to the capital and so stable, it kind of almost became the de facto imperial court. Because and all of the imperial letters and
He can run
business
stuff from the
was running from his
there,
area.
yeah.
And he was the first person to send Sushi food and money and all these things when she fled the capital.
Yeah.
Because again, he could do it, right? Because there weren't foreign armies marching through his province, burning things down.
Yeah. My. That's
And,
very dramatic.
Yeah, and there was no Boxers going around breaking down telephone poles or burning railroads because he killed them. So his firm grip on the province, kept it from going into chaos. His views on foreigners became more clear by the event. He strongly believed in not triggering conflicts with foreign powers, as China's clumsy diplomacy and weak armies always put China on the losing end. He, however, did not give foreigners any more rights than required. For example, he did not let the 8-nation army into Shandong province, citing the lack of death from Boxers, as said. And this is a thing, you talk about, it's like China would sign treaties with foreign powers in certain situations, and then they would just sign it, and then they would just not follow it because they're like, they're just barbarians. They'll just sign this thing. They'll get out of here. And they just would think the problem would go away.
Yes. I mean, I'm supposed to think all these treaties are very humiliating.
Well, they are humiliating.
But nowadays, we don't really honor the treaties or not that are not humiliating either.
Yeah.
So we call them historical documents. That's a dig on
Yeah.
Hong Kong.
Yeah, right?
But
and it's like, because he was like, okay, well, we're weak.
yeah.
Despite the fact that we can't necessarily protect ourselves, it's these foreign nations, they still look at each other and it looks and they kind of will keep each other in check a little bit.
Yeah.
But if we piss people off and start fights,
Yeah.
then, they're going to do
So
stuff.
he had certain principles. He wanted to do things by the book. He didn't want to
Yeah.
sign a thing and not respect it. And
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I would say that's generally a better practice.
But it did give him a reputation of being soft on foreigners, right? Because,
Yeah.
for example, he put down the
Because
Boxer
he's not
Rebellion.
hawking at them.
Yeah, he's not hawking at them. So for the next 10 years, he became the governor of Jili province, which encompassed Beijing, Tianjin, and what is now Hebei province. This is the core province of
Northern China.
of modern China. And if
Yeah.
you're in charge of it in the Qing court, you're kind of like, I don't know, it's more than just being in control of a province. You also have kind of an imperial role as well. So he restored order. He personally escorted Cixi back to the capital with his army and took control. This was the most powerful role yet. Unlike many previous diplomats, He had an open mind and an ability to cooperate in order to achieve his goals. For example, the settlement that had ended the Boxer Uprising outlawed Chinese troops within 10 kilometers of Tianjin, which is this city on the coast, which is sort of like the Shanghai of the North almost. It's where all the foreigners were.
Yeah.
So in order to keep order, Ren opened a police academy and began to train China's first Western-style police force. So he's trained a couple thousand policemen. So he's like, well, they're police. They're not soldiers. And China did not really have this concept.
No, we didn't have
police before that.
Yeah.
So he started that. He worked on anti-bribery measures, cut down on bureaucracy, and opened professional schools to train managers. And like we said before, the assumption was before that if you knew enough about Confucius, you could get put in charge of any job.
Yeah,
and
any
job. And supposedly
you could go manage the Yellow River.
Yeah,
you could go manage.
You could be
agriculture,
doing an army,
build a bridge,
diplomacy, be in charge of a ship, right?
Yeah.
So he's like, no, we got to have schools, and he ended the Confucian civil service examination.
I wonder why.
Yeah, right. He never got his degree, Cherry. He never got it. He began Western education and educating women. He built over 8,000 schools by 1907.
Wow, okay.
He pushed for constitutional reform and sent agents to study foreign constitutions. And when I say constitutional reform, it's, like the Magna Carta. Mm-hmm. You still have a king.
Yeah.
But there's a framework of what the king is allowed to do.
Well, he wanted a constitutional monarchy.
Yes, he wanted a constitutional monarchy. He's like, we need a framework that the emperor is within.
Yeah.
That defines powers. And it's not just they can do everything. Mm-hmm. He experimented with regional autonomy and elections. So in Tianjin, they did local elections.
Wow.
Did ballots, elected their own officials, which is the first time, I think, ever in Chinese history that this was done.
And he did that, not Sun Yat-sen who did that.
No, yeah, he did that, right? In Tianjin.
I mean, I guess he was on the ground.
Yes.
In the court. Mm-hmm. Have the power. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, and he has the ability to do these things, right? Because he is basically, at this point, the most powerful person in China.
Yes.
He cracked down on opium smoking. He started a campaign against foot binding. He encouraged women to attend school. And he set up covert methods for female servants to report abuse, because he thought that female servants are always, they have no way of, retaliating or getting justice if they're abused by powerful people. So he put he'd set up back channels for them to report if they're being abused. So he also became China's foreign minister in 1907. He tried to make China a figure on the world stage, building up foreign legations and consulates. He tried to protect Chinese people overseas and, help them out. He built up international diplomacy. Though he kept up the Qing Empire tradition of monitoring and attempting to kidnap Sun Yat-sen, calling him traitorous son.
Yeah. So
Sun Yat-sen in our last episode, the guy who started the revolution that founded the Chinese Republic.
Yeah.
He's gonna pop up in the story.
Oh really?
Yeah.
I think they're the arch enemies.
Yeah. It's Sun Yat-sen is Luke Skywalker. It's Luke Skywalker and Ren Shikai is Darth Vader.
Yeah.
Or maybe Emperor Palpatine. So, but in 1908, Cixi died, as old people do. And within weeks, Ren Shikai had essentially fled to the countryside. And this is when people say Ren Shikai is like the first warlord. If he had really just been a warlord and controlled the country, he wouldn't have had to flee when Cixi died. But he was given power by her. He was her favorite little subject. Yeah. And she died, and there was essentially like a soft coup against him.
Yeah. I think one of the things, because I really want to do some episodes on Cixi, and one of my impressions is that she loved power. She was good at consolidating power, right? That's why she was in power for so long, almost all her life.
Yeah.
But then she just sort of was so addicted to it and loved it so much that she didn't really have a contingency plan for what's going to happen after she's gone. Yeah. She didn't consider really much of that. No. So things fall apart immediately. Yes. After the person who had the power, was no one handed to, died.
And that's basically, and that's what happens here. So Ren Shikai flees to the countryside. Yeah. He's afraid he's going to get killed. He gets people in the Manchu court basically say, oh, you should go rest in the countryside, right? And then that gives him an out. So he can go run away, essentially. Yeah. And he builds a little manor and stuff. He built a manor, had sex with his concubines, wrote poetry. and he engaged in business to provide for his huge family. And we say family, it's like 200 people because, he has like 30 concubines and like 50 kids and all these things.
Yeah.
And he invested in all these railroads and things. So apparently this delighted Sun Yat-sen, who was kind of an accelerationist of thinking like the worse things are in China, the better chance I have of doing a revolution.
We're going to get to the new ages.
Yes. Yeah. So he thought, Ren Shikai's out. There's no one at the wheel.
Yeah.
And essentially that's what happened. The people who were in charge of the empire basically screwed it all up. I mean, it was already screwed up, but they couldn't keep it together. And within a couple of years, the Wuchang Revolution happened. Wuchang Revolution. Yeah. And the imperial court freaked out.
As they should have.
Yes. And armies and this is in the south of China, right? So it's a bit far away, but Ren Shikai's army was sent to deal with it, but they refused and said, we're not going to follow your orders. We want Ren Shikai back.
Loyalty.
So there was some back and forth. And long story short, the court basically gave Ren Shikai whatever he wanted as long as he put down the rebellion. It's a little bit debatable.
So now they need him.
Yes. They're like, whatever you want, just do it. Put down the rebellion. No one was really sure what would happen. And the thing that a lot of people assumed was this was going to be like Zheng Guofan from 60 years earlier, who was the guy who, when it seemed like there was no hope for the empire, he put down the Taiping Rebellion and put Humpty Dumpty back together again and kept China going for another 50 years.
Yeah.
And they're like, damn, Ren Shikai is going to come. He's going to kill everybody. And this is going to limp along for another 20 or 30 years.
Yeah. So not in accordance with Sun Yat-sen's accelerationist beliefs. I never thought of him as but I guess he is.
He is, right?
I never thought of him that way. Yeah.
And so foreign observers were uneasy about more unrest, especially, because they live in China too. But they enthusiastically followed Ren's return. So this is what the New York Times wrote about him. A man of such nerve, such cunning, and such diplomacy was needed at that time. At that time, they mean the Boxer Rebellion.
Yeah.
In China and in Peking. Today, apparently, the same man has been found. So they're like, Ren Shikai, he's the best they've got. He's going to figure this out.
Okay.
So he started by ensuring the loyalty of his troops. He visited field hospitals. Apparently, his concubines gave out gifts to the people, making sure they all had good food, all the kind of standard stuff. And his troops would continue to be unfailingly loyal through the next several years. He began blockading and wearing down the rebels in Wuhan, killing hundreds for minimal losses of his own, because the rebel troops, Sun Yat-sen's troops, essentially, they didn't really know what they're doing, right? Even though they were eager. And unlike most Qing troops, Ren Shikai's troops really did know what they were doing. Eventually, though, the losses added up, and he was impressed by the bravery of the revolutionaries. Also, the imperial treasury was almost empty, so he needed to bring an end to the war. Sun Yat-sen was also worried. He had over 100,000 troops, including a young Mao Zedong, future, ruler of the People's Republic of China. But they had little training.
That's a well-known fact. What are you saying it's a secret?
I guess it's not a secret, right?
Yeah.
So, but little training and not enough weapons or supplies. So they're like, okay, let's just ask Ren Shikai if he'll deal.
Yeah.
Right? So there's numerous benefits to this plan. People would stop dying. The longer things went on, the more likely a foreign power would take advantage. Ren Shikai was internationally respected. So if he becomes a president, everybody will accept this new government. No one had really recognized Sun Yat-sen's government in Nanjing. So, and also Ren Shikai knew how to keep order and build and run a government. So obviously all the people involved in this revolution have no experience running any sort of government in China, because they're all rebels and stuff, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, obviously,
they're outsiders.
The point is to tear it down.
Yeah.
But in the short term, China is a huge place, right? So it's like, you still got to make sure the rivers don't flood. You got to get taxes. You got to do all these things.
Yeah.
And so they're like, well, Ren Shikai knows how to do all these things because he did it, right? So he was basically in charge of the country. So Ren Shikai was also intrigued by the idea, fearing that a lengthy civil war could cause China to fracture into warring states. He, however, wanted a constitutional monarchy, not a republic. Eventually, though, Sun Yat-sen convinced him, and Ren Shikai agreed to be interim president of the Chinese Republic. So the idea was, there's going to be a election in a couple of years, and then you're going to just see over it until we can have the election. You're going to be the interim president.
Yeah.
However, there were some complications. Sun Yat-sen had already created a government in Nanjing, which we visited actually, while Yuan Shikai thought it should reside in the imperial seat of Beijing. He said, China is one country. Whatever the future political solution, either monarchy or democracy, the two sides should absolutely obey the assembly. China will continue to be one country and will never be viewed as two divisive states. So one China policy is clearly
started by Yuan Shikai. So he didn't want to move the capital.
No,
because he wanted the old sort of rule to continue, and in a way.
And also, though, I think it's less that. I think it's more like, he doesn't trust Sun Yat-sen, right? I mean, he's just some guy, right? So he's like, well, I'm not going to go down there under their power.
Yeah.
Under all these people.
This is my base.
Yeah, this is my base.
Yeah.
Right? I'm going to rule China from here.
Yeah.
Right? And if you want to have your Congress over there, that's fine. But like, I'm going to be the real power and, with all of my troops and stuff.
Yeah.
So, but in order to get anywhere, first he had to convince the imperial court to abdicate, which they were still technically
the imperial court, yeah.
Right? And this is with Puyi and Puyi, the child emperor who's like 4 or however old he is.
Yeah. The last emperor.
And
until you have
and the regent who's his mom.
Yeah.
And
and the last emperor until
last emperor for now. Which we'll get to
in a few minutes.
Spoiler alert, it's Yuan Shikai. So he convinced them to abdicate. He's like, we'll give you a lot of money. He's like, if you don't abdicate and the revolution spreads, I can't protect you. You're all going to get murdered, right? So they agreed to do it.
They didn't have any other choice.
They didn't really have any other choice, right? So revolutionary assassins made an attempt on his life immediately afterwards as he was leaving the imperial palace, getting them to abdicate. Killing and wounding several of his guards. Interestingly, several of the assassins were women. So this is a cross-gender revolution here.
We're uniting all people.
So several other high-profile assassinations of Manchu nobles were also carried out and are credited for the lack of Qing court resistance, because there's quite a few Manchu princes who are like, screw this, right? We're not going to let you abdicate, right? Once like 5 of them got murdered by the assassins, then they're like, okay, fine.
People.
What was that?
Who assassinated them?
The revolutionaries. Like, I'm not saying Sun Yat-sen ordered it, but they're pro republic revolutionaries. So overall, the country seemed to have a national mood of republicanism, even if most, including Yuan Shikai, did not know exactly what that meant. For most, it simply meant an end to the ineffective rule of the Qing. So they're like, yeah, we're going to have a republic. And it's like, what's a republic? It's like, well, not this. This isn't a republic. This empire, right? It's going to be great. And then 2 days later, Yuan Shikai was voted provisional president by the Nanjing Assembly, taking over from Sun Yat-sen. Of all the presidential elections in world history, this is what they told him, the Nanjing Assembly, only Washington enjoyed unanimous approval. Now you, sir, have repeated Washington's record. So he's China's George Washington, right? So Yuan Shikai became the president, but he stayed in Beijing, the seat of his power. Everyone seemed thrilled with the outcome. Western observers bluntly observed that Sun Yat-sen had known nothing of China and was the wrong person to govern the nation. With such a great man at the helm, how could this new Republic of China be headed for anything but success?
Is that where we're ending?
That's where we're ending on this episode. This is where we end Everybody Loves Yuan Shikai. And then next episode, we're going to do Everybody Hates Yuan Shikai. We're going to find out why he was vilified.
Intriguing. After all these great things he's done for China.
I know, Cherry.
How could he fall off the pedestal?
I know. How could he?
I guess you will have to subscribe. Yeah. And tune in next time.
You don't have to subscribe. You could just click it. But okay, subscribe.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think.
Wow, that's interesting. Was
that a more even-handed?
Well, I don't know if about even-handed. I think it's more about praising him. Yeah. Everyone loves him, but the interesting thing.
Everybody did love him at the start,
but
right?
I think I would say, from my limited common sense, history knowledge from, I don't know, middle school, history classes, Chinese history classes, is that he was shown as a very one-dimensional character.
Yeah.
Which, it's textbooks. You don't have much time. You got to go through all the famous characters of history.
Mm-hmm.
But he definitely is vilified. I don't know whether it's justified or not. I guess we'll wait to see in the next episode. But he definitely is more known for being the last emperor of China.
Yeah.
Having been elected, not to give it away, been elected unanimously by the assembly.
With so much hope.
And then he turned around and sort of pulled a fast one on them. So that's... If you want to know what that means, again, tune into the next episode. Yeah. But that was what I knew him as, you know. And all these reform, all these, how much grip he had on China is something of a backstory that's overlooked.
Because in order to fall, you first have to rise.
Yes. Right? So how did he get there, right?
How did he get to these heights?
Yeah.
And you also got to think that, Sun Yat-sen and the revolutionaries, they thought they could deal with him, right? They thought he's a modern, reasonable, forward-thinking guy. Yeah. Right? He's not this...
Which you could... There's some good reasons why they might think that based on what he did.
So it's not just all a fluff piece, right? Even people back then, they thought, well, we can put him in charge of China. We could trust this guy. Yeah. He's Yuan Shikai. Yes. Everybody loves Yuan Shikai. Yeah. I guess boxers
don't
like Yuan Shikai, but
but most people did. Anonymously. What do you call it? Like everyone voted for him.
Oh, unanimously.
Unanimously. Yeah.
And it's very interesting because there's he has this long speech and all these things, and he's talking about republicanism, but he's also privately asking people what's exactly a republic? Like what is a president like a king? Because he knew other
They're
countries.
Like, no.
Yeah, because he knew he's not stupid, right? Mm-hmm. But he knew other countries had presidents or they had prime ministers.
Yes.
And from his view, those people are in charge of the country.
Yeah.
Right? Because it's like he doesn't necessarily see from China all of these politics and arguing in parliament.
Yeah.
He doesn't see the United States Senate and stuff arguing, right?
Yeah.
To him, it's like, oh, well, they're in charge. And those other people, they're just kind of...
And I'm in charge, so I'm basically that.
Yeah, I'm basically that, right? And so and so we'll get into it. But one of the things that, surprises him is like, oh, the Congress can tell you to go screw yourself, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And you have to...
Division of power. Yes. That's not a familiar concept to Yuan Shikai. The other thing I thought was interesting is that when you said about him being Shandong, being the provincial government, mm-hmm. obviously he has a different name. It's not really a government, but a governor. Mm-hmm. But he was in charge of the province, right? But he was able to just keep his own rule, and it's almost like it's like a state system.
I mean, at this point, China was 400 million people.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Right? And it's very decentralized because obviously the imperial court is centralized, but a lot of places they don't, they just don't have telegraph lines, things like that. So it's like there's no real way to govern.
No.
I mean, what is it? The heaven is high and the emperor is far away. There's no real way to govern these places, right? Yeah. Which is why I think Yuan Shikai was worried, because he's like, well, all a province has to do is just not listen.
Which he didn't listen.
Yeah, which they didn't listen. And it's like, well, then now you have to fight a war to get them back.
Yeah.
Can China win that war? Right? You know what I mean? Like things are so bad right now.
Yeah.
That we can't afford to alienate everybody. But and this is why I think the whole abdication thing was so attractive to him and was attractive to Sun Yat-sen, because if the emperor abdicates, or the emperor regent essentially abdicates, because he's like 6 or something, and declares China a republic by imperial decree, now there's a continuation of government, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So,
it's not a coup, it's a transition.
Right. And so he became president by imperial decree, essentially, and the Republic of China became, and that, that gives it a legitimacy that, well, then who can argue that, right? I mean, if you can't, it can't be a civil war. It can only be a rebellion at that point.
Yeah.
So
I'm excited for the next episode.
Yeah, I mean, what can go wrong, Cherry? What could go wrong?
Well, I guess now everyone loves him, and there's no way, nowhere to go besides going down. That's going downhills, right? So we'll see.
Yep. Well, anyway, thank you for listening. And after this next episode, I think we're going to have some slightly more cultural or modern one. So apologies if you're tired out by modern Chinese history, but thank you for listening.
Yeah. Thank you for listening. See you next time.